Hi everyone, my name is Purvi Makwana. I'm a consultant with OpenWave and I've been involved in a few of these IFRS 16 implementations so far. This session is titled IFRS 16 Dimensions, Logic and Templates. So today we're going to go through some of the dimensions in the IFRS 16 model and talk about various dimension properties and their purposes. And I'll mention a few of the dimension members as well that are significant in the IFRS 16 calculations. And then we can talk about the logic files that are involved in the IFRS 16 model. And some of this will need updating, so there's a references file I'll talk about in more detail later on. And finally, I'll go through a few changes that need to be made to some templates before the customer can start using them to create leases. Okay, so the IFRS 16 model is the financial type model and it's periodic. It contains 10 dimensions. We have category, Lse account, Lse asset, Lse currency, Lse entity, Lse flow, Lse interco, Lse ref, Lse revision, and Lse time. It's assumed that the customer will want to use their own category dimension, and the IFRS 16 model also allows for customers to use their own entity and intercompany dimensions if they wish to, or they can choose to use the Lse entity and interco. So I'll begin by going through each of these dimensions. So the customer can use their own category dimension, as I mentioned, but there are a few properties that need to be added for the IFRS 16 computations to work. So these are these properties here, beginning with Lse Underscore. There's 9 of them. So the lease cat type takes values of either empty, forecast, or budget, so it's which lease category a lease will fit into. This is a property used for loading retrospective A or fully retrospective leases, and it's a reference category. I'll show you it in the dimension in a moment, it might make more sense. So this causes the category type to be overridden. So when we're loading normal leases, it picks up lease properties from the Lse Ref dimension. However, when we're doing transitional leases of type partially retrospective A or fully retrospective, we need to do 2 data loads, one for the data from the transition period up until present period and also the historical data. And for the historical data load, we need this override property so that we can pick different start and end dates in the Lse Ref dimension. So if you remember from the previous session, when we did the load of the historic data, we used the reference category IFRS 16 underscore FR and reloaded the start and end dates. This is where it picks those up from. So here you can see an example of the IFRS 16 FR being used as the reference category, and the property value in this override dimension is FR, which means the categories with this property will pick up these these historical start and end dates. Okay. There are also 2 members that need to be added to the category dimension. Sorry, I forgot to mention. There is a no category member that needs to be added if one doesn't already exist, and also this IFRS 16 FR member. Okay, the next dimension I'll talk about is Lse Underscore account. So the IFRS 16 model has its own account dimension that is used for all of the computations. The CNS account parent stores all of the accounts that hold data that's to be moved into the consolidation model. The accounts under lease commentary stores things such as comments and start dates and end dates. This lease payments node is not used anymore. The OP underscore Lse underscore accounts parent stores all of these accounts which are used to hold values that are input into the IFRS 16 model. So these are populated when you use the create leases template and the lease payments template. And finally, this RUA accounts parent holds all of these accounts which store the results of the calculations when you run IFRS 16 calculations. The account dimension also has properties target account and target flow. So if the customer is choosing to push data from the IFRS 16 model into their own consolidation model, you can map these accounts and flows to the corresponding ones in the consolidation model. The Lse Asset Dimension is a user-defined dimension, and it's used to store all of the different asset types that an asset can be classified under. These asset types can be customized based on what the customer is wanting to use for their IFRS 16 solution, so you can update these. This flag here, if I show the ID, it's called Asset Disk Rate. So if you remember in the template IFI 001, when we enter lease parameters, we can choose to enter discount rates against the entity, the currencies, the asset type, and the lease length. So that's configured using these disk rate properties. So for the asset disk rate, if the property value for no asset is blank, then this means we can input discount rates against asset classes. But if this property value was Y, then we wouldn't be able to. This IFRS 16 asset property is just a flag as to whether or not an asset type is IFRS 16 applicable. And also there's some properties here for mapping these asset types into the consolidation model. So this is for the cost, the depreciation, the depreciation charge, the interest charge, the liability. Next we have the Lse underscore currency, so the lease currency dimension. And this stores reporting currencies, local currency, as well as lease currencies. So these are transactional currencies and they're all prefixed with L underscore. And this is what's used when you first input a lease, and then it later gets converted into reporting currencies. So you can see there's the currency type property, the currency code, and again, there's this disk rate property. So if under local currency the property value is Y, then this means you can't input discount rates against currency types. If this value was no, then we would be able to. Okay, next we have the entity dimension. So as we mentioned earlier, the customer can use their own entity dimension or use the Lse underscore entity dimension. If they're using their own entity dimension, the ent disk rate property needs to be added. So again, this is another one of those properties used for configuring where the discount rates are entered against. And if this property value for no entity is blank, then we are able to input discount rates against entities. And if this value is Y, then we don't enter discount rates against specific entities. So these are two things that need to be added, the no entity member and the ent disk rate property, if the customer is using their own entity dimension. If they choose to use this one, there is also a property to map to the target entity in their consolidation model. So next we have the Lse underscore flow dimension. So under the parent LF total, we have all of the flows that are used for IFRS 16 specific things in this model. So we have the opening balance, the new lease liability or asset value. This flow is currently not used. This LF underscore reduce underscore LSE is used for liability adjustments when a lease is revised. This flow is used for reversing the asset cost or depreciation at the end of the lease in order to remove the asset from the balance sheet. This is used to store interest. This is for lease payments. This is used for residual guarantee fees. This is used for service fees, and this is a currency translation adjustment. We also have the LF discount rate parent, and under this we hold all of the flows that are used to input discount rates against the lease length. So these properties can be adjusted based on what the customer wants to store their lease length, so you can increase or decrease the gap between these. And when you do that, you will need to change the value of some properties, which I will show you in a moment. We also have the LF metadata flow, which is used to store the autofill setting. So if you remember, when you create a lease, when you enter payments, you can choose whether you want that payment to be copied across all lease periods, manually input, or spread across all lease periods. So this flow holds the value 1 if you're copying, 0 if you're manually entering lease payments, and -1 if you're choosing to spread a payment across all periods. Okay, so if these intervals here are being changed, then these properties here will need to be updated. So this is the lower limit and upper limit of the month. So this is from month 0 to 24, 25 to 60, and so on. So if you do adjust these, that needs adjusting too. And again, we have the disc rate property to configure whether or not a customer is able to input discount rates against the lease length. So if the value against no flow is Y, then that means discount rates cannot be input against lease length. And if this value is blank, then we can input discount rates against each of these lease lengths. Next, we have the Lse Underscore Interco Dimension. The customer can choose to use their own intercompany dimension, or we can use this one here. And there's also the option for target intercompany to be added, so that mapping to the consolidation model can be configured. The next dimension is Lse Underscore Ref. This is another user-defined dimension, and this stores the unique BPC ID for each of the leases. So we have parents for monthly, quarterly, and yearly leases. And then we have each individual lease stored here as well, with the properties holding the different lease data, such as start dates and end dates and currency. So we can see under the monthly parent, we have each of the leases which are incremented by 1 at a time. And then the same goes for quarterly and yearly. So I'll just go through some of these properties. So a lot of these are filled in when the template IFI 002 is used to create the leases. So we have the asset type and the currency and the cost center and things like that. We also have this lease category dimension, and this is when a category is selected in the lease creation template. It stores a lease as being a budget lease, a forecast lease, or an actual lease. The cost center property is just a generic property to store the cost center name. The lease creation date is automatically completed when you create a lease. So this is where in the review and commentary page of IFI 002 we can choose to view leases created today, and that's pulling information using this property here. The currency is filled in using that template when the lease is created as well. Same with the depreciation rate type, discount rate type, the lease document. So remember, this could be a URL or a document name. The lease duration is automatically calculated when the start and end dates are entered. And the dates are stored as an Excel date as well as a BPC time ID. These are just flags, so this is a flag as to whether or not it's an IFRS 16 lease. It can take the value of Y or N. This is whether or not it's an intercompany lease, an internal lease. This property can be used to give the name of a parent lease if a lease is part of a group. This lease prep mid-pay property is for partially retrospective leases when transition occurs midway through a lease period. So for quarterly leases or yearly leases, if a transition was on January 2018 and the quarterly lease payments were on December 2017 and March 2018, the transition would be occurring mid-period. So that's what this property is used for. This payment increase frequency can take values of monthly, quarterly, half-yearly, yearly, biannual and ad hoc. Again, these are just filled in using the Create Leases template. This property here is used by the script logic to determine the number of months after the start month of a lease period into which a payment has to be made. So this value is used to refer to the next underscore and then number property in the lease time dimension. So I'll show you that in a moment. Lease payment point takes a value of 0 for payments that are made in advance and 1 for payments made in arrears. Again, the start and end dates are stored as an Excel date and a BPC time ID. This is a flag as to whether or not it's a sublease. This stores the transition type, so if a lease is fully retrospective, partially retrospective A, or partially retrospective B. And this is storing so these LFR underscore properties are used for fully retrospective or partially retrospective A leases. So remember, when we load the historical data, it needs to be reloaded again. So these are the Lse Ref properties that the category dimension was referring to earlier. So it pulls in the duration, start and end dates for the historical data. Then finally here we have all of these custom properties. So this could be anything that the customer specifies, and they can choose to use all, some or none of these. Next dimension is Lse Underscore Revision. So this dimension is used to support revisions to an existing lease during its lifetime. And this dimension will require a bit of maintenance. So as you can see, there's Rev 00, 01, 02, 03, and so on. And each time more revisions are made, more of these members will need to be created. For each revision, there is also a Contra Member, so 00A, 01A, and these A members are used to store the Contra values for periods where you're making an adjustment. So, for example, say you're extending a lease, the months that you're writing data over from the existing lease periods, this contras the payments that are already entered there and then saves your new values in the next revision. And these properties are used, so this next revision property is how it determines where to save the next revision. So that will also need to be maintained every time a new revision is added into this dimension. And finally, we have Lse Underscore Time. The IFRS 16 model requires its own time dimension because oftentimes you need more time periods than are included in the customer's own time dimension. So this is because it needs to go as far back in the past as the oldest lease if the partially retrospective A method is being used, and it also needs to go as far into the future as the end of the longest lease for any transition method. So as well as the generic time dimension properties, we have these next properties as well. So this is the next period, this is the next period plus 1, next period plus 2, and this goes on all the way up to the next period plus 10. And then the same goes for prior, so this is the default prior property, and then we've added some more for the prior period minus 1, prior period minus 2, and so on all the way up to the prior period minus 10. There is also this target time ID, so this is the time member that corresponds to this ID here in the customer's time dimension, so that everything can be mapped into their consolidation model later on. And the target closing time in the customer's time dimension, and the target prior time in the customer's time dimension. There is also this transition period, so the transition time ID property, and this is filled in for the member 99999. So let me just find. And this stores the transition date for when the customer is transitioning to IFRS 16. So here it is, 2019 January, and it's stored against that. Over time, the customer will need to add more members to this time dimension and also maintain all of these next and prior and target properties. Okay, so those are the 10 IFRS 16 dimensions. There is also something worth mentioning, that if a customer is choosing to push data from the IFRS 16 model into their consolidation model, they will need to add a member to their audit trail dimension to keep track of this. So, for example, a member called lease, so that all leases that move from IFRS 16 into consolidation can be tracked. Okay, so that's it for dimensions and properties. Next, I'll talk about some of the logic files that are used in this model. So just ignore these were used in development. There are four or five logic files that you need to pay attention to. There's 01 lease calc, and this is used to calculate the right of use asset lease interest, the depreciation and the lease payment values. And then we have 02 lease conv. This is used to run the translation from lease currency into local and reporting currency, and also to convert periodic data into year-to-date data. Then we have 03 lease transfer. This is to transfer the data into the consolidation model, and this references logic file in order to pick up the mappings into the consolidation model. The default logic file copies the present value of payments from the base level time periods to 999999 in order to give the starting lease liability value. And then finally we have this references logic file here. Now this file will need updating based on what the customer has named their dimensions and where they want to map things to in their consolidation model. So here, any dimension names that are different from what's been written will need updating. So if they call their category version, or their entity has a different name from Lse Underscore entity, same with intercompany. And then the rate types also need to be checked. So if they are not AVG or CLO, this will need updating. And this is the mapping of the consolidation dimension members, so this might also need maintaining depending on what the customer is using in their consolidation model. And finally, these are the flows that's being mapped to, so just make sure that these correspond to what they should be. There are also some logic files in the consolidation model that need to be added for the IFRS 16 computations. So we have this IFRS 16 clear lease piece of logic, which clears the lease audit trail member prior to copying lease data into the consolidation model. We have this references file here, which contains all the consolidation model variables. I'll open this up in a moment. And we have the IFRS 16 retained earnings bit of logic. So this runs the retained earnings and carry forward business rules. So once again, in the references logic file, these dimension names will need updating based on what's being used in the customer system, as well as these flows. And that's it for the logic files. The final thing that we need to go over is that when templates are moved into the customer system, there are a few changes that need to be made. So the first thing is that the menu sheet in all templates needs to be configured. So if we unhide these columns here, the first thing to check is that the system type matches what your customer system is. So in this case, we're using NetWeaver. Then you need to check the dimension IDs match. So if any dimensions are being used that have different IDs and descriptions from these, then this needs to be updated, as well as the default member name. So for example, if I_none is called intercompany none or another variation of this, that needs updating. Then if you remember, the lease document property has a local member formula, and it can be either one of these depending on whether a customer is using a URL to store their lease documents or if they're using a document library. So these are the formulas that can be entered into the local member to configure that. And then finally, in this template, we have the customer-specific lease properties, and their names can be updated here so that when you go into lease setup, it shows the property names that you've configured it to. So that needs, not this necessarily, but these other bits need configuring in all of the templates, and then this document property and these customer properties are specific to the IFI 002 create leases template. Something else that will need to be done in this template if the customer is using the custom properties is to configure the validation rules. So I'll just need to unhide a bit more here. So for these customer-specific properties, they have their validation checks here. So this has the maximum length. So if they're using lengths that are different from these, then you just update this number here, and this will change the validation rule so that it will show as valid if they enter any values longer than 1. So that's it for template configuration. Just make sure to hide everything once you're done. And that's the IFRS 16 model, the dimensions, the properties, the logic, and the templates.